private suite, Era 1, the Gables estate, winter of 1989. The air inside the master bedroom smelled of expensive French perfume and the sharp medicinal tang of oxygen tanks. It was a heavy scent, the kind that clings to the back of your throat long after you've stepped back out into the cold. I remember the sound of the wind that night. It didn't just howl, it shrieked against the stone walls of the estate, clawing at the window panes like a starving animal trying to get in. But inside, everything was deathly still. The only rhythm was the rhythmic, metallic click of the clock on the mantel, counting down seconds that felt like hours. I had been called to the Gables many times over the years, usually for gala dinners or holiday blessings. But this was different. This wasn't a celebration of wealth. It was a wake for a living soul. She sat propped up against a mountain of silk pillows, her body so thin it barely made a dent in the mattress. This was the woman who had ruled the local social scene for 5 decades. Her skin was translucent, like fine bone china that had been dropped and glued back together too many times. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut I'd seen in old oil paintings downstairs, was now a shocking brittle silver, pulled back so tight it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent state of surprise. But those eyes, they hadn't lost their edge. They were icy blue, sharp enough to cut through the dim yellow light of the bedside lamp. She didn't greet me. She didn't offer a hand to shake. She simply stared at the fireplace, where a low flame was struggling to stay alive. Her hands, resting on the duvet, were the most striking thing about her. They were skeletal, the knuckles swollen with age, yet they were weighted down by rings that could have bought a fleet of cars. The largest was an emerald, a deep poisonous green that seemed to glow in the shadows. It looked too heavy for her. It looked like it was pinning her to the bed. She began to speak, and her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a concrete driveway, rough, thin, and desperate. She told me that the walls of this house were built on a foundation of silence. She spoke of her late husband, a man I remembered as a pillar of the community, a man of industry and iron will. She spoke of the 3 children they had raised, Julian, the lawyer, Clara, the philanthropist, and Marcus, the youngest, who had never quite found his footing. I sat there, the wooden chair groaning softly under my weight, a small protest in the silence. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. As a chaplain, you develop a 6th sense for when a story is about to take a turn into the dark. You feel the temperature in the room drop. You feel the weight of the air change. She reached for a small, leather-bound box on the nightstand. Her fingers trembled, the emerald ring clinking against the wood. It was a sound I'll never forget, a tiny, metallic death knell. Inside the box was a letter dated 1974. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed from being handled 1,000 times in the dark. I watched her face as she looked at that paper. The ice in her eyes didn't melt, it shattered. She told me that for 15 years she had carried a secret that had turned her blood to vinegar. She had discovered, through a hidden correspondence and a medical record her husband had kept buried in a safe deposit box, a truth that rendered her entire life a beautiful, expensive lie. Her husband, the great patriarch, the man whose name was etched into the granite of the city library, had been sterile since a childhood bout of mumps. He knew it. He had always known it. The silence that followed that sentence was louder than the storm outside. I felt the breath leave my lungs. I looked at the photos on the mantel, the 3 Vance children, now adults, smiling in their graduation gowns, their weddings, their successes. I thought of my own father, a man who had nothing but a toolbox and a name he kept clean. I wondered if he would have traded that honesty for the silk sheets and the emerald rings in this room. She leaned closer to me, the scent of her perfume suddenly overwhelming, like flowers left too long in a vase of stagnant water. She told me she had spent the last 48 hours watching her children pace the hallway outside. They weren't mourning her. They were measuring the drapes. They were calculating the inheritance. They were waiting for the matriarch to finally let go of the keys to the kingdom. But she had one final card to play, a document she had drafted in secret, a testament not of wealth, but of blood. She looked at me, her grip tightening on the 1974 letter, and asked me if a lie could ever become the truth just because enough people believed it for long enough. I looked at her, this woman who had everything, and realized in that moment she had absolutely nothing. I felt a pang of pity that I couldn't quite suppress. I've seen men die in gutters with more peace in their hearts than what I saw in that silk-lined bed. Can a family truly exist if the very blood in their veins is a ghost? The Gables estate. 2 hours past midnight. I watched her thin, blue-veined hand reach for a crystal glass of water on the nightstand. The emerald ring clicked against the glass, a sharp, fragile sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. She didn't drink, she just held it, staring at the condensation forming on the surface. I could feel the cold radiating from her, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside, and everything to do with a heart that had frozen over decades ago. She began to tell me about the summer of 1954. She described the heat of that year, the way the air in the valley felt like a damp wool blanket, and how her husband, the man in the silver-framed photos with the sharp, unforgiving jawline, had looked at her with a mixture of pride and hidden shame. He was a king without a prince, a titan of industry whose line ended at his own skin. They had been married for 5 years, and the whispers in the country club were already beginning. In those days, a man's virility was his currency, and her husband was bankrupt. She spoke of a pact, a silent, whispered agreement made in the dark of this very room. He wanted the legacy, she wanted the security, so they went looking for a donor, though they never used such a clinical word. They looked for genetic potential. They found a young man, a drifter who worked on the estate's gardens for one single season. I remember her voice trembling as she described him, a man with messy dark hair and a small scar above his left eyebrow. He was paid a sum that would change his life, and in exchange he vanished into the fog of history, leaving behind 3 children who would never know his name. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of nausea. I thought of Julian, Clara, and Marcus, the children I had seen grow up in the pews of my church. I had baptized them. I had seen them take their first communions. All this time, they believed they were the inheritors of a grand industrial dynasty. They walked with the posture of princes because they believed the Vance blood was a sacred fire, but it was all a shadow play. Their father had bought them like he bought his fleet of black sedans. Eleanor looked at me, her icy blue eyes searching my face for judgment. I didn't give it to her. My job wasn't to judge, it was to hold the lantern while she walked through the wreckage of her own life. She told me that the 1974 letter wasn't just a revelation of the sterility. It was a letter from that long-lost gardener, written on his deathbed, asking to see his investment. Her husband had intercepted it, kept it as a weapon, a way to ensure Eleanor never left him. He had used the truth as a leash. As she spoke, I found myself thinking about my own mother. She died with nothing but a worn Bible and a recipe for apple cake, but when she looked at me, There were no secrets. There was no fine print in our love. I realized then that the opulence of the Gables was just a very expensive cage. Every velvet curtain was a gag. Every silver spoon was a piece of evidence. I've spent 40 years listening to the dying, and usually they want to mend fences. They want to heal the cracks. But Eleanor Vance was different. She was using her final breaths to tear the fences down and burn the wood for warmth. She told me that she had spent the last decade watching her children. She saw the Vance cruelty in Julian's business dealings. She saw the Vance arrogance in Clara's charity balls. They had inherited the worst traits of a man who wasn't even their father, simply because they believed they had to live up to his shadow. Then she told me about the stranger. "There is a man," she said, "living 3 states away. He is a high school history teacher. He has a crooked nose, kind brown eyes, and a mop of curly light brown hair. He lives in a small house with a porch that needs painting. He has no idea that he is the grandson of the man her husband actually owed everything to, a distant, forgotten cousin of the great Vance, who had been cheated out of his shares in the company 40 years ago." She reached under her pillow and pulled out a new document. It was crisp, white, and bore the seal of a law firm from the city. She told me she was signing it tonight. The estate, the accounts, the jewelry, the emerald ring included, would not go to the 3 children waiting like vultures in the hall. It would all go to this teacher, to a man who didn't know the Vance name carried a curse. I asked her why. Why destroy the lives of the 3 people she had raised? She laughed, a dry, hacking sound that ended in a cough. She said that her children had been raised on lies, and a life built on a lie is a house built on sand. She wanted them to find out who they really were when the money was gone. She wanted to see if they could survive without the armor of a stolen name. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't justice, it was an execution. And yet I couldn't look away. I felt a strange, dark urge to see the look on Julian's face when the will was read. I hated myself for it, but that's the thing about the dark. It calls to the dark parts of you too. I want you to stop for a second and think about your own family. Think about the stories you tell yourselves at dinner. Are they true, or are they just comfortable? Sometimes the most honest thing we can leave behind is the truth that hurts the most. She held the pen over the paper, her silver hair shimmering in the firelight. She looked at me one last time and asked, "If you found out your entire identity was a transaction, would you want to keep the change?" Private Suite 01, the Gables estate, 4:01 a.m. The fire in the hearth was no longer struggling. It was a roaring, hungry beast, fed by the heavy oak logs that the butler had brought in an hour ago. The room felt smaller now, the heat pressing against my chest like a physical hand. Eleanor sat with the new will resting on her lap, her skeletal fingers tracing the embossed seal as if it were a talisman. The emerald ring, that poisonous green eye, seemed to catch every flicker of the flames, dancing with a wicked, silent joy. Then came the sound. It wasn't a knock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather shoes on the hardwood floor outside. It was a confident sound, a sound of ownership. The door groaned open, and Julian Vance stepped into the room. He was in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first church's entire renovation budget. He had his father's jawline, sharp, uncompromising, and his father's eyes, though tonight they were bloodshot and narrowed with a desperate sort of greed. He didn't look at his mother first. He looked at the bedside table. He looked for the paper. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of my neck. I've stood between angry men and their targets before, but this was different. This was a man realizing the ground beneath his feet was actually a trap door. "Mother," Julian said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "The doctor says you're agitated. You should rest. I'll take those papers to the study for safekeeping." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at him. She looked at me, and for the first time that night, I saw a ghost of a smile on her thin, pale lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally found the match she'd been searching for her entire life. She reached out and picked up the old 1974 letter, the one that proved the Vance bloodline was a fiction, and held it over the candle burning on her nightstand. The paper didn't just burn. It curled and shriveled like a living thing in pain. The smell of charred history filled the room, sharp and bitter. Julian lunged forward, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What are you doing? That's the record of the estate. That's our legacy." "No, Julian," she whispered, her voice suddenly clear, cutting through his shouting like a razor through silk. "That is the record of your bankruptcy, not of your wallet, but of your soul. You are a Vance in name only, and tonight I am taking the name back." I watched as she took the match and touched it to the corner of the original will, the one that left everything to the 3 children. The flames licked upward, turning the names of the heirs into black, weightless flakes of ash. Julian let out a sound, a choked, guttural cry that sounded like a wounded animal. He reached for the burning paper, but the heat was too much. He stood there, the prince of the Gables, watching his kingdom turn to smoke in the middle of a bedroom. I felt a wave of profound exhaustion wash over me. I realized then that I wasn't just a witness to a legal change. I was a witness to a spiritual arson. I saw the way Julian looked at his mother, not with grief, not with love, but with the cold, calculating hatred of a man who had lost a bet. I thought of the history teacher 3 states away, probably sleeping in a bed with mismatched sheets, unaware that a dying woman was currently burning down a dynasty to give him a life he never asked for. Is it a gift to be given a fortune built on a graveyard of lies? Or is it a curse that simply changes hands? Eleanor's hand began to shake, the emerald ring sliding down her thin finger. She looked at me, her icy blue eyes finally softening, the fire in them dying down to embers. She gestured for me to come closer. I leaned in, the scent of smoke and old perfume thick in the air. She whispered that she had spent her life being a mirror, reflecting what her husband wanted to see, what the town wanted to see. She was tired of being glass. She wanted to be the stone that broke the mirror. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy curtains, Eleanor Vance took her last breath. It wasn't a struggle. It was a long, slow exhale, like a balloon finally losing its air. Her hand went limp, and the emerald ring, the weight she had carried for 50 years, slipped off her finger and hit the floorboards with a dull, final thud. It rolled under the bed, disappearing into the shadows. Julian didn't cry. He didn't call for the nurse. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy and hollow. He was a man with a name, but no home. A man with a history, but no blood. I stayed in that room for a long time, watching the smoke from the fireplace drift toward the ceiling. I thought about the children we raise and the expectations we strap to their backs like lead weights. I thought about the difference between a legacy and a burden. I've seen many people leave this world, but I've never seen anyone leave it with such a scorched earth peace. I walked out of the Gables that morning as the snow was finally stopping. The estate looked beautiful in the dawn light, a white, pristine palace, but I knew knew what was underneath. I knew about the gardener. I knew about the 1974 letter. I knew that the truth is a fire that doesn't care what it burns, as long as it reaches the oxygen. I still see her face sometimes when I close my eyes, the way she looked at that burning paper. It reminds me that we are all just keepers of secrets until the day we aren't. We spend our lives building walls out of gold and titles, hoping they'll protect us from the wind, but the wind always finds a way in. Before you go today, I want you to look at the inheritance you're building for those you love. Is it made of things that can be burned, or is it made of the kind of truth that stays standing even when the house is gone? If you're ready to open another page of my diary and discover the secrets we carry to the grave, click the subscribe button and join me in the quiet moments of the past. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Would you like me to help you draft the legal document Eleanor left behind? Or perhaps start a new entry about a different soul I encountered in the winter of '85?